In 1966, Dutch soil scientist Wim Sombruk made a bold claim that shook the world of agriculture. The Amazon rainforest was cultivated over the course of nearly 1,500 years by ancient people groups who unlocked fertility in an unprecedented way using pottery shards, compost, bones, and a diverse set of organic inputs. But one ingredient within the black gold soil they were able to generate stands out from the rest: biochar. However, it wouldn't be for another 40 years, in 2006, that the International Biochar Initiative would be formed during the World Soil Science Congress, that a new world of agricultural potential would be opened up for home growers and large-scale farmers. Now, it's worth mentioning that the indigenous Amazonian people were far from the only ones who were experimenting with charcoal in their growing operations. Dozens of other cultures throughout the African and Asian continents have been discovered having added charcoal to their soils, and it begs the question, why? So in this video, I'm going to detail how biochar works, the simplest way to make it, and some crucial mistakes that you need to avoid before adding it to your garden. And then we'll conclude with several examples of ways that you can take your biochar to the next level by curating the nutritional and microbial populations within this source of pure carbon. This video is going to get a little technical at times, so if you'd like to skip over to the exact recipes that I'll be showcasing, we'll have everything timestamped. You can feel free to do so. That said, I did a fair bit of research and prep for this video, largely so that I could feel really confident about my understanding of this incredible soil amendment. So if you want to get that deep dive, I think you might walk away with a better understanding of why we treat charcoal the way we do and how it really works to maximize fertility in the garden, the food forest, the meadow, wherever you plan on using it. So how does biochar actually work? Because you can get this wrong. Not in a way that will permanently damage your garden, but you could skip some pain if you make sure to get it right. Biochar is a pure carbon source that contains a huge number of nutrients and microbes housed within its porous structure. There is a wide range of numbers that I could give here based on the quality of the material and how it was made, but at the lowest estimates, a single gram of raw charcoal contains between 20 and 50 square feet, or 2 to 5 square meters, of internal surface area. And on the upper end of estimates regarding activated charcoal, the surface area can surpass 20,000 square feet, or 2,000 square meters per gram. And what that allows you to do, in essence, is really maximize nutrient and microbe housing capacity of a given space within your garden, perhaps your entire garden. So if you're growing in pots on the patio, this may help you to get some substantially larger yields as plants have more sustainable access to microbes housed within the biochar. You might be able to plant more densely than you would otherwise with your regular compost or raised bed mix. For larger scale gardeners, it really gives us the opportunity to bank long-term stores of nutrients and beneficial microbes that, in theory, will struggle to die off, or to put it in the affirmative, will be enabled to survive season to season. Now, applying empty or raw biochar to the garden is going to do something unfavorable for your garden. See, with pre-loaded biochar, when applied to the soil, plant roots and microbes engage in their nutrient exchange, business as usual. But raw biochar is going to soak up the nutrients and microbes in the area that it's introduced. And the reason for this is because fresh biochar is made of carbon skeletons with lots of negatively charged sites, meaning that all of the positively charged soil nutrients like ammonium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, they're all going to be super attracted to the biochar, chemically speaking. You might remember from high school chem that there are anions and cations. Anions are negatively charged, which confusingly means that they have gained electrons. Cations, on the other hand, have lost electrons and carry a positive charge. And so through electrostatic forces, electrical charges are pulled together through what's called ionic bonding. And this is the principle that underlies how biochar interacts with chemical nutrients, retaining and exchanging ions to support plant health. When raw biochar, or just what we would call charcoal, is made, it goes through the process called pyrolysis, which we'll come back to a little bit later. During pyrolysis, though, the non-carbon parts of the original material are burned up, leaving behind some oxygen atoms that are bound with hydrogen and carbon. As these groups are exposed to water and as they interact with soil minerals, they leave behind a negatively charged site, which is basically a parking spot for cations. Now, because biochar contains so many parking spots, so to speak, there's virtually no limit to the amount of nutrients that it can adsorb from the soil, leaving the soil temporarily depleted of those nutrients. And I'll pause briefly and mention this distinction between absorption and adsorption, because in my preparation for this video, I realized that I had them a little bit confused. Absorption is what happens when a sponge soaks up water, whereas adsorption occurs when the absorbed substance accumulates only on the surface of a solid or a liquid. Charcoal adsorbs nutrients, which allows it to carry all that it does. It also absorbs water, meaning that it retains moisture within its porous matrix. Now back to raw biochar, while applying it to the soil directly without loading it up with nutrients does soak up nutrients from the soil. It doesn't mean that every nutrient is locked up, but it will inevitably cause temporary nutrient imbalances. This also means that the microbes migrate in the direction all their food went, taking up residence in the charged up biochar. Now here's the thing. Over the course of a few months after applying raw biochar to the ground, the negatively charged sites will get saturated with the positively charged nutrients. Microbes will have had the chance to colonize the pores and the surfaces and will re-engage with the plant nutrient exchange and start decomposing organic matter as food. They'll also start to die off naturally, and their microscopic decomposing bodies will re-impart nitrogen and other nutrients back into the soil food web. And honestly, beyond this, I don't think I'm really able to explain how it all works. But what many people have found is that give it a season and a field where raw biochar was applied will recover. Plant roots can start tapping directly into pieces of biochar and getting nutrients from them. It's a beautiful thing. But as you may already know or may have guessed, thankfully, there are plenty of workarounds for this process. We don't have to kill our gardens for a season in order to get this stuff to work. Instead, we can preload it with nutrients and microbes and then apply it to the soil. Now, there are many ways to make this raw form of biochar. Some people say that you need to use a very precise type of kiln that limits oxygen and has multiple chambers and collects the wood vinegar and sap that it produces and produces zero smoke and single-handedly saves the planet. And then I've also heard people say you can just buy briquettes from the dollar store and use those. Quite the range of opinions on this one. We've got a video on how we make our charcoal, but I'll reiterate our approach and share a bit about why we do it this way. The goal here is to burn the wood at a very high temperature while limiting oxidation and reducing smoke production. To do this, I use a version of what's called the Kontiki method, which is just where you dig a cone-shaped hole in the ground that is a few feet deep. Mine is typically 2 to 3 feet deep and then 3 feet across. So 3 feet across, and then it slopes down so that the center of the bottom of the hole is 2 to 3 feet deep, forming a cone shape. Since I am typically burning in a suburban environment, this is the extent of the size of the fire pit that I'm allowed to burn in. But if you're in the country or a more rural part, there might be some different rules, and you can make bigger trenches or holes. If you're not allowed to burn at all, then there certainly are a number of sources that you can purchase properly made biochar from. We'll link to a few of them in the description if you'd like to just bypass the DIY approach. But if you do want to make this, whenever you burn anything, of course, be as safe as possible. Keep a water source ready at all times. Don't leave the fire unattended, etc., etc. Please be careful also not to burn yourself. This can get really, really hot. The general approach here is to start the fire and to add layers of material to the top of the fire before the lower pieces of wood turn to ash. So as it's burning, the moment that I see the white ash films start to appear on the surface of the wood, I'm adding more feed in a thin layer, just enough to cover the flames. And as that new layer ignites and burns at the surface, the lower layer is deprived of oxygen and chars instead of turning to ash. The reason that the cone shape helps facilitate this process is because the sloping walls reflect and concentrate radiant heat back into the pit. So if you were burning a pile on the flat ground, all the heat would escape out the sides. Here, it's hitting the sloped walls and retaining the heat, which keeps the combustion zone hotter. The wide opening at the top of the cone hole enables a really strong flame zone to form across the surface, which consumes oxygen that is trying to enter from above, limiting oxygen in the lower levels of the pit. This means that at the very top, there's lots of oxygen, it's burning really hot, and gases are completely combusted. Just below the flames, there's little oxygen, and this is where the process called pyrolysis occurs. All of this results in a clean burn, meaning that there is little smoke being produced because the volatile gases are being burned and carbon is being retained. Again, like a lot of stuff when it comes to biochar, this is just slightly over my head, and I could probably explain this a bit better. So comment below if you have a better explanation of how the process of pyrolysis works. The main thing here is that I want to demonstrate a middle ground approach that hopefully is just that, approachable. For home gardeners or folks living in suburban or urban environments, of course you got to check with your local regulations and burn as safely as possible. The thing is with the super technical modified burn barrel setups is that it feels unrealistic to me that the indigenous people groups that we learned a lot of this from actually even had that technology or those pieces of technology. I'm more interested in replicating something closer to a method that they may have used to actually make charcoal, like the Kontiki approach. There's evidence of Amazonian peoples, African, Asian, Scandinavian, and other European people groups using similar methods throughout the centuries, so kind of worldwide. I just think for most people, using a double kiln with an inner chamber to carbonize the materials and an outer chamber to provide the heat might be a little bit out of reach. Not saying it's not effective. It probably is a more efficient way to make high quality activated charcoal. But again, for now, I'm content using a steam activation method where once I'm done burning my Kontiki pit, I dump lots of water onto it all at once. And when the water heats up super fast, it produces steam that widens the pores within the charcoal. Again, this is not the most effective or efficient way to do it. It's the most realistic for me, and it gets the job done. I wouldn't recommend buying dollar store charcoal or other stuff that has really anything added to it. You're just really looking for a pure source of carbon, and a lot of those store-bought charcoals have stuff added to give extra flavor to your food or to burn better, longer. Don't recommend going that route. If you can find something clean at the store, feel free to use that, like some lump hardwood charcoal from barbecue suppliers, or like I said, we'll link to some specific charcoal options that you can buy online. But this method that I outlined is a fairly doable one for most home gardeners, I think. One simple check that you can make to test your material to see if it's carbonized cleanly is to crush the charcoal up and rub it on your hands. It'll turn them black. But then try washing it off with only water, no soap, and if it comes off and your hands are clean, you know that all the oils and the impurities and stuff were burned off properly. You also really want to check and make sure that the wood itself is all burned up fully. You don't want unburned chunks of wood going into your garden. Unlike biochar, those won't sort themselves out after a year in the soil, so it's important that whatever you apply to the soil is actual biochar, not just singed wood chunks. A few aren't going to hurt, obviously, but best to just try to take those out before charging it. The last piece of the puzzle here too is crushing the charcoal. This is an interesting one as well that I've heard people from all sides of the fence weigh in on. Some people say that you want to make it into a powder, and then others say that it's okay to not crush it almost at all. I land somewhere in the middle. A little powder is probably fine, but it seems logical that there's not really much in the way of structure if you've made black dust out of the material. And on the other hand, if you don't crush it up at all, it's going to be harder to disperse throughout the garden bed, and it'll be a lot harder for worms and arthropods to incorporate the biochar into the lower layers of the soil. So I like to crush it up and sift it through a 1/2-inch hardware cloth sifter, and then that's ready to use in the garden after we've loaded it, of course. But if I'm going to put in the worm bin, for instance, I usually will run it through a 1/4-inch sifter. May not be necessary, but I do it anyway. Point is, you don't need to stress about this. If you're doing it on a small scale, especially if you don't need fancy tools, just your shoes. You can use a concrete tamper like this and it'll work great. You could run it over in burlap bags or something with your car, but typically I'm just crushing it with my shovel and my feet. Now, I hear a lot of people use the terms charge, load, inoculate, prime, condition, infuse, and many others. So for the sake of this video, and hopefully going forward I can stay consistent on this language, I'll use the terms charge and inoculate. And the reason for those two is that there are really two processes happening here when we prepare our biochar for soil application. The first one, as I already mentioned, is when we add nutrients to the charcoal. And the second one is when we add microbes. For nutrient loading, I'm going to use the term charge, and for microbe loading, I'm going to use the term inoculate. Generally speaking, the idea is to do these things either simultaneously or to charge your biochar and then inoculate. And we'll discuss why and how in a second. As for the simultaneous charging and inoculating, the simplest and probably most effective way or efficient way of preparing biochar is simply by incorporating it into a compost pile. We'll go over a lot more ways to charge it up and inoculate your biochar. But one last thing in this area before we continue is that in addition to charging and inoculating charcoal, we also need to make sure that we're helping it transition to a hydrophilic state. And again, this is easy to do simultaneously with the other steps, but I wanted to mention it in case you wanted to just try mixing it with dry ingredients. If you were expecting them to soak it up, whoops. Charcoal is highly porous, as we already talked about. This means that its water holding capacity is extensive, much like a sponge. It can draw in and retain lots of water, but unlike a sponge, because of its chemical and physical structure, charcoal is initially what we call hydrophobic, or deathly afraid of water. Or more accurately, perhaps, it doesn't initially do the whole sponge thing well. And there are some really specific sciencey words that I could use here, but the shortcut version is it takes water a while to find its way into all those pores. So most of it will sort of bead off because initially the surface structure is unaccommodating. If you were to toss a piece of charcoal onto the surface of some water, it would float, but hold a piece of charcoal underwater for a while and it will gradually soak it up. This process ranges in length of time. My general advice would be to give it at least a few hours or more, likely a day or two. With pre-soaking your biochar, again, it's not as though you will ruin your garden forever, but you won't be able to charge and inoculate it very effectively until it's undergone that absorption process. Additionally, and this may feel like a bit much, but there are some studies that have shown that up to 5 wetting and then drying cycles performed over the course of several weeks have shown to greatly improve the hydrophilicity, or the water carrying capacity, of biochar. So to reiterate and summarize, in order for charcoal, activated or otherwise, to be ready for usage in the garden, it needs to be treated in several ways. It needs to be converted to a hydrophilic or a water-loving substance rather than staying hydrophobic. It needs to be charged or loaded up with nutrients, and it needs to be inoculated with microorganisms. All of this will occur naturally in the soil on its own, but it will take time, and we also lose some opportunities potentially to set it in a specific direction, which we'll cover another section in this video. Now that we've defined how charcoal needs to be treated in order to get to the point where it can be added to garden soil, let's start by going over some of the easiest ways to do this. Again, we're trying to speed up the process so that we can use it more quickly and start reaping the benefits sooner. But a fairly passive way to charge and inoculate biochar is by giving it to your chickens or other livestock to snack on and poop on. Chickens will intuitively peck at chunks of charcoal to help with their digestion, helps them sort out gut imbalances. I like to incorporate a very small amount in my chicken feed for them to just chew on. And then when it comes out the other side, it's preloaded with nutrients, especially nitrogen. Of course, just incorporating it in their bedding is a great way to passively load it up, but it also does the double duty of soaking up odors and reducing smells from your chicken pen or coop. Highly recommend giving this stuff to your livestock in some form. Of course, if you have larger animals that are producing large amounts of manure, or you know someone who wants to offload some of theirs, you can pile the manure up and layer in charcoal, wetting it down as you go, and this helps add nutrients and microbes. We've already mentioned probably the easiest and most often usage for biochar that I work into my system at least, which is using it as an ingredient in compost. Charcoal is a carbon material, obviously, so you need to be a little careful of that so that if you're making hot compost, you don't skew your ratios. But a little goes a long way, and even just layering it in small amounts is going to help soak up water, soak up nutrients, and soak up thermophilic microbes. Another little tip there is if you're making hot compost, a lot of that heat causes ammonia to off-gas, meaning that you're losing those nutrients. But adding biochar, a thin layer even at the top of the pile, can actually catch and trap the off-gassing ammonia, helping you to reduce those emissions, which is pretty cool. Now, if you don't want to go through the trouble of making a hot compost pile, you can also just soak your raw biochar in nutrients that you've mixed up or dissolved in water. You obviously need a bucket or a barrel or container, depending on how much you're trying to soak up at one time. But this is where things get interesting for a variety of reasons, because we have an interesting opportunity here, as well as a few easy mistakes that we could make. So I said earlier that we either want to charge and inoculate our biochar at the same time, or we want to charge and then inoculate. And why might that be? Well, without a food source, microbes are going to die off. To my knowledge, there aren't many, if any, that can digest pure carbon. Microbes need a wide spectrum of nutrients, and if they don't have them, they can diminish as a result. Now, most sources that I've found or read about will say that soaking charcoal in a compost or worm tea is one of the best ways to charge it. But there's a couple problems that I see with this approach. One is that these aerated compost teas that you can make are specifically and intentionally rich in microbes and lacking in nutrients. They're not really used to impart nutrients, just biology. To make an aerated compost tea, we usually add some food sources, but again, that's food for the microbes, not for the garden, meaning it seems like it wouldn't be enough for the highly porous, high carrying capacity of charcoal. Now, you may be able to avoid this by feeding your aerated tea a molasses food source and some extra minerals. But the other issue here is that since the compost tea is aerated, you can't exactly soak the charcoal in it for a long period of time because the culture would start to favor anaerobic microorganisms. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what we're going for when we're culturing an aerated compost tea set of microbes with a bubbler. You could add a bunch of charcoal to the bucket that you're aerating the tea in, but then you'd hypothetically have to keep adding nutrient-rich ingredients to keep the microbes fed. The interesting thing about charcoal is that because of its structure, it really has the ability to house both anaerobes and aerobes. Anaerobes, by the way, are microorganisms that thrive in an oxygen-scarce environment, and aerobes are microorganisms that need oxygen to survive. Charcoal contains both macropores and micropores, and nanopores. The macropores are what allow airflow, keep water moving through. It's where the plant roots will enter. These are the oxygenated zones within the charcoal where aerobic microbes can live. In micro and nanopores, however, it's too tight for oxygen to diffuse quickly, so these little anaerobic zones get created, and beneficial or facultative anaerobes, such as lactic acid bacteria, can inhabit these spaces. But if the entire piece of charcoal is submerged in liquid, those aerobic pockets get filled up, and aerobic microbes go bye-bye. This is the same with our garden soil, by the way. When water pools in a poor drainage spot of the garden or yard, it starts to smell funky because anaerobes have taken over in that spot. But generally, healthy soil contains both aerobic and anaerobic microbes. This is one of the things that I learned from Young-Sung Cho in his book, Jadam Organic Farming. Soil aggregates contain anaerobic microbes. It's not like our soil is just 100% fully and constantly aerated. There's both down there. So when it comes to biochar, we've got ways that we can keep it that way. First of all, the easiest way to charge and inoculate your biochar is by making a batch of Jadam liquid fertilizer and then just using that to soak the charcoal in. This is probably the most common way that I've done it. I will usually take that stuff and run it through my compost system. But you could also apply Jadam liquid fertilizer soaked charcoal directly to your garden beds. To make it, you just add leaf mold soil, crop residue, and water to a bucket and let it ferment for a few weeks or years. Soaking your biochar in this stuff is actually a really great way to get those nutrients to hang out in your soil and to keep them from leaching away. You could also take it a step further and make a customizable Jadam liquid fertilizer charged biochar. This would maybe mostly make sense if you're trying to only grow one or a few types of crops. The idea is that you use a single crop residue to make a plant-specific liquid fertilizer. So if you had a strawberry farm, for instance, you could collect all the leftover or diseased or gross-looking strawberries that you didn't want to eat or sell, toss them in a bucket with the leaf mold soil, and let them soak for a few months. Then you could use this to charge up your charcoal and make a strawberry specialized biochar that would re-impart beneficial nutrients and microbes specifically designed to help facilitate better strawberry production the next season. Of course, you could create an all-purpose version of this by just making an all-purpose fertilizer out of grass clippings or comfrey or purslane or whatever, and then using that to charge your charcoal. It's up to you. What really interests me is actually the potential for creating a different kind of customized biochar soil amendment, specifically ones that might favor bacterial or fungal inhabitants. And if this feels like a strange distinction, bear with me for now. The thing is, generally speaking, depending on what kind of plants that you're trying to grow and what kind of growing space that you're hoping to cultivate can determine the preferential inclusion of either bacteria or fungi in that soil. For example, in annual garden beds where you're growing a lot of veggies and maybe you're doing succession plantings, taking plants out of the ground, poking holes in there for new starts to go in mid-season, this kind of soil is going to benefit from bacteria and will house it perhaps a bit better and more reliably than fungi. Not saying that we don't want to let fungi in, just that it's not going to do quite as well season to season. Healthy bacteria, generally speaking, is what will help your annual veggie and flower patches to thrive. On the other hand, perennial systems like fruit bushes, trees, shrubs, permaculture, landscapes are all really going to benefit from healthy fungal cultures, especially those mycelial networks that get established in the soil and become more robust season to season. Mycorrhizae specifically needs plant roots in the ground to feed it and stay alive. So depending on what plants that you're trying to cultivate in various areas of your yard or in your raised beds or pots can determine what kind of inoculant that you use for your biochar. Are you with me? This means we might want to think about what we're using to inoculate our biochar with, and that means that we need to think about what we're using to charge our biochar with so that we can provide the proper food source for said inoculant. Of course, you might be asking the question, why not both? And of course, yes, we're always going to have bacteria and fungi in our soil. Why focus on cultivating one versus the other in biochar? And the basic reasoning there is because of the way that bacteria increase and the speed at which they do so when compared to fungi. Bacteria reproduce every 20 to 60 minutes. They exude polysaccharides and form biofilms on the interior of the biochar surfaces, and they produce antibiotics, organic acids, and other reactive compounds that, when produced in large amounts, can inhibit fungal development. Compared with fungi, who take hours or even days to build hyphae, bacteria are going to move in, if given the opportunity, and crowd out the space a little bit. They're also faster at ingesting simple compound nutrients, which can starve fungi who rely on a steady carbon source to build hyphae. Again, bacteria aren't really bad for garden soil. They're essential and super helpful, especially when we're cultivating annuals. But as we consider how we inoculate our biochar, we might want to think more specifically about what nutrients that we're charging it with prior to that inoculation, depending on our goal. And this isn't to say that bacteria-rich biochar will forever stay in your garden as a bacteria-dominant material. Again, we're giving things a head start. We're tipping the scales in one direction to kick things off. In the end, your soil will sort itself out based on its needs. We're just looking at a way that we can speed up the process. So for the rest of the video, I want to give you a starting place for how you might create a bacteria-dominant biochar versus a fungi-rich biochar. And then you can decide which sort of input that you'd like to make based on your goals in your garden. By the way, if you're growing in the northern hemisphere like me, we're just coming into autumn, depending on when you're watching this video, which is starting to conclude the growing season. Now is an excellent time to amend your soil and prepare for next season. So if you're thinking that it's too late for you to make something like this, think again, because now is actually an amazing time to get this stuff on your soil. Of course, if you're watching this from the southern hemisphere, you will also have the opportunity to bless your garden with one of these, whatever you decide to make. Overall, gardening and soil building is just a long-term effort. We got to be thinking of this as a long-term investment, not a short-term cash in, cash out operation. Let's go over the ingredients that we're going to look at that will feed our microbes, and then we will take a look at our microbial inoculants that I'm going to use. First things first, let's talk through the very high-tech equipment setup that we're going to need. In order to do this particular way that I show you, I apologize, you will need a 5-gallon bucket. You'll need something to mix the ingredients in, like a jar, and you'll need a shovel. Again, I realize it's a pretty tall order, but you won't get too far without these 3 tools. Next up, we've got our ingredients. Now for this, there is no set of specific ingredients that you have to use. There are tons of options, of course. I'm just going to show you the ones that I'm using. For my Bacteria food brew, I'm going to keep things simple, and I'm going to charge my charcoal with some fermented fish amino acids, some fermented plant juice, some unrefined non-iodized sea salt, and some water-soluble calcium acetate. Now, why these ingredients? Well, first of all, I have them. That's a big reason. Second of all, these are pretty high-quality food sources for bacteria, in my opinion. The fermented fish amino acids I've got here are a long, gently extracted source of free amino acids, peptides, and nitrogen. It contains some residual sugars from the fermentation stage. The way to make this is by mixing fish waste with brown sugar and letting it ferment and extract the nutrients over the course of many months. And then the fermented plant juice is just the plant version of that, made out of comfrey in this case, which is a very nutrient and enzyme-rich product. Ordinarily, this is applied to plants foliarly in very diluted amounts, so its main job isn't to supply the plant with nutrients, but here I'm adding a bit more to provide some food for the bacteria. And then the salt is going to provide my bacteria with some more trace minerals and is going to keep the brew balanced. The water-soluble calcium acetate is a vinegar-extracted mineral source made by soaking eggshells in apple cider vinegar or brown rice vinegar. And that positively charged calcium is going to find a home in the negatively charged charcoal. The residual acid from the vinegar isn't enough to really lower the pH of the alkaline charcoal too much. Bacteria prefer neutral to slightly alkaline soil. You can use whatever you've got on hand. I only would not recommend adding synthetic fertilizers, really because they don't typically feed biology. They're only water soluble and don't need to be processed by microbes prior to becoming available to plants. If that sounds like it would be a good thing, just check out my soil biology explained video and you can learn more about the way that microbes feed plants and vice versa. For my fungal food, I'm going to be adding some fermented fish amino acids. That residual sugar is candy for bacteria, but with the inoculant that I'm using, that'll be fine. If you don't have fermented fish amino acids, by the way, you can feel free to use something like fish hydrolysate or fish meal here. And then I'm adding kelp meal and humic acid that I collected just by straining water through my compost in a fine mesh bag. Humic acid and kelp meal are great fungal foods. I'm also adding a bit of apple cider vinegar to bring the pH down, since fungi are more sensitive and prefer slightly acidic soils. Again, we're just trying to sort of tip the scales here, not curate the whole experience. The microbes should know what to do. And then finally, I'm adding in some of my herbal extract. This is another Korean natural farming input called Oriental Herbal Nutrient, or OHN. And this is going to help create the environment that our fungal inoculant is going to live in. For both of these, I'm starting by mixing them up a little bit in water to get them dissolving before incorporating them into a 5-gallon bucket, sort of like mixing a roux in cooking. You don't want clumps of flour in the soup if you can help it. And here I've got my filtered water. You don't want chlorine and chloramine in there. That's going to mess with the conditions, in my opinion. So filter that out or let it off gas overnight, or you can use a bubbler to do it very quickly. And now that we've mixed it all up, we can add our charcoal. This is going to soak for at least a week. If you've got more time, you can go longer. Basically, we just want to give the charcoal the chance to soak up as much of the nutrients in the water as possible so that it's all ready to receive the inoculants. Now, why wait to add the inoculants? Well, this goes back to what I was talking about with aerobic and anaerobic microbes. We've got the ability to house both in the biochar, but if we were to inoculate now, the microbes, I believe, would largely skew toward the anaerobic, since all of our biochar is submerged. And fungi, especially, is pretty particular about its moisture levels. Can't be too wet, too dry, as we're getting these to multiply and inhabit. So we're going to go through the whole charging stage first before moving on to inoculation. I've got a couple of these that I started a few weeks ago, and they should be ready to inoculate now. Both are hypothetically charged up with nutrients that are in tune with their inoculant's food preferences. So now we're going to introduce the inoculating microbes to their new home. And for our bacterial inoculant, we're using the Jadam microbial solution. This is something that I make quite often. I've demonstrated a lot on this channel how to make it. Couldn't be simpler. Basically, you're taking leaf mold soil from the forest, feeding it cooked potato by straining both through a fine mesh bag like a paint strainer into water, adding a big pinch of sea salt, and then letting it brew at room temperature for a few days or until you see bubbles forming. There will be a thick disc of foam on the top of the water in the bucket, and then you're just trying to wait and use it until the bubbles are most active. Wait too long and the microbes will start to die off, and don't wait long enough and they won't have proliferated enough. It generally takes me 48 to 72 hours to finish a batch of JMS in the summer. Temps 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 to 27 Celsius. I started this a few days ago, and it's about ready to use to inoculate my biochar. Now, the reason that I'm using this particular inoculant is because the bacteria in here are going to be some of the strongest, most robust, and tuned-in bacteria from my local region, hypothetically speaking. The reason that we collect soil from the forest is because it hasn't been disturbed by people or contaminated by agricultural byproducts. It's just been allowed to hang out and thrive out in nature. So those are the microbes. Again, largely bacteria that we're getting in this homemade inoculant. Now, there are tons of other inoculants that you could use here. You could use a lactic acid bacteria serum made out of fermented milk. In fact, I'm going to add some of mine in here as well, just to bring in a little bit more diversity. You could also use something like EM1, Effective Microorganisms 1. You could honestly use a lot of different bacterial inoculants. JMS is just one of the simplest and easy to make. Doesn't take long at all. For our fungal inoculant, I'm of course going to use JMS's cousin, IMO4. And this, if you're unfamiliar, is another way of culturing forest microbes, but in such a way that we collect and preserve a lot of the fungal cultures. keeping them intact, and then we diversify them by taking them through a number of additional steps to grow them out. You can check out our videos on that if you'd like to make this stuff. Point is, IMO4 is going to be really good as a fungal inoculant for our fungal biochar. If you wanted to use something else, you could use just some of that leaf mold soil that we used to culture JMS with. It's a little riskier and less stable than IMO4, but with the fungal foods that we're feeding it, it could tip the scales to establish a fungal dominant inoculation. All of this is very hard to know exactly if and how it will all work, right? Unless we had some fancy microscopes, we're really going to have to wait and see with regard to how we see the fungi forming in the soil where we applied the fungal dominant biochar and how our perennials do in that curated environment. Now, in addition to the IMO4, I'm going to add in some leaf mold and some wood shavings to this charged biochar because that's going to give the fungi in the IMO4 an additional food source to slowly consume. Now, what's tricky here is that I want to soak my biochar in the microbial solution, but I don't want the microbes to die off or to go anaerobic. I also need moisture to wet down my IMO4 and carbon materials, but again, I'm trying to keep the materials from going anaerobic. So here's my idea for how to really do this best. For my bacteria-based biochar, I'm going to use my bubbler to aerate the JMS biochar mixture for 24 hours. Now, if you don't have a bubbler, you could very likely just pour the JMS into a bucket of charged biochar and then stir it up periodically a few times over the course of the day. And then I'm just going to strain it out so that it doesn't go bad. I'll use the leftovers to water into my garden. Then to keep the bacteria char moist until I'm ready to apply it to my garden beds, I'm just going to store it in this burlap sack that I use to strain out the microbial solution. It's going to stay aerated and it allows drainage as needed, but the material is going to keep moisture from evaporating off too much. For the fungi char, I'm going to mix up the charcoal with the wood shavings, the decomposed leaves, and IMO4, and then I'll wet it down with some dechlorinated water to make sure that everything stays properly moist. This I'm going to also store in a burlap sack just to keep it transportable and aerated while staying covered until I'm ready to put it on my perennial garden beds. Now, this, I will admit, is a little over the top and probably isn't entirely necessary. If you've followed the channel for any length of time, you might know that I am a bit of an experimenter. I like trying things out, especially if they're done the hardest possible way. But that might not be you, and that's totally okay. And the fact is, while we have substantial evidence of ancient people groups using this material intentionally, what there is even more substantial evidence of is that charcoal plays a crucial role in the natural world in ecological systems. Wildfires, terrible and destructive as they are, especially when caused by careless humans, in nature occur as a way for the earth to bring balance to local ecosystems. Many plants and animals have evolved adaptations that allow them to survive or even benefit from periodic fires, and fire can create new habitats that support different species. So it might be fair to say that while we as modern growers are mimicking ancient human agricultural practices, we could also likely say that those ancient humans were mimicking processes that they saw at work in the natural world already. And that's what many, myself included, build their framework for agriculture off of, the natural world. So all that is to say, if you want to try this stuff out the way that I outlined it, sweet. If you'd rather be a bit more casual about it, you're probably all right doing that. You don't have to make either of these biochars, but hopefully you could walk away with a few ideas on how you might go about charging and inoculating your biochar to best enhance and amend your garden soil. And there are a few specific takeaways that I hope that you'll take with you and think about as you think about applying this. One is that you need to make sure that you're finding a way to give your microbes, aka your inoculant, a food source, so that they can actually stay alive and thrive in the charcoal. You gotta go for both. Another thing I hope that you can appreciate is the need to keep your biochar aerated once it's been charged up with nutrients. If you want your inoculating culture to stay alive, you can't just let it hang out submerged underwater and expect the aerobic microbes to stay alive. To my knowledge, this stuff will eventually sort itself out over the course of time spent in your soil. But again, what are we doing charging and inoculating our biochar in advance in the first place? We're saving ourselves time. The time that it would otherwise take away from us after applying it raw to the garden. Again, to reiterate, charcoal is generally considered a net positive in the long run. Your soil will just suffer in that first season of application. That said, if you are breaking ground on a new spot on your property next year or in a few years, you could hypothetically just dump raw biochar on that area. That said, there is a point of diminishing return with biochar, kind of like with worm castings or really anything, you typically don't want to add biochar to the soil too much too quickly. Better adding a little bit gradually over the years. At least that's what the actual experts say. Remember, the people groups who applied biochar to the Amazon rainforest were estimated to having done so over the course of a millennia and a half. Take your time and add as you go, growing season to growing season. I think that the benefits really start to peak after a few applications per year. And overall, experts generally recommend applying biochar to garden soil at rates ranging between 5 to 10% within the first 4 to 6 inches of the soil, which roughly translates to 3 to 6 cubic feet per 100 square feet of growing space, or 1 to 2 kilos per square meter. Again, probably no need to go weighing out ingredients with extreme precision. Just don't go dumping biochar, sky high, piled up on your garden beds at the beginning of the growing season and expect things to go very well. Start by top dressing a thin layer and mulching over top. Over time, it'll work its way into the soil with the help of microscopic animals. At the same time, if you're just starting out and breaking new ground, like I said before, maybe with a first-time till, you might want to be a bit more precise with how much you use so that you can take advantage of that initial tillage to work the biochar into the lower layers of your soil. All of our videos are intended on giving you ideas for ways that you can explore bringing fertility and resilience to your garden. Something like this is really maybe way beyond anything that you actually need to try. But maybe it got you thinking about something else. I'd love to hear in the comments what you're up to or going to try. As always, thank you for watching. And if you want to check out how we make our own steam-activated charcoal at home, you can watch that video right here. Otherwise, see you in the next one.